Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of a 4-part series with the Sports Lawyers Association. Once again, my name is Aaron Hernandez. I'm the director of the Sports Law and Business program at Arizona State University, and we're happy to be talking to you today about virtual networking at the SLA. And we're honored to be joined by Leigh Hawley. Leigh is the Associate Counsel for Sport, Business, and Entertainment at Leopoldus Law in California. So welcome, Leigh. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me, Aaron. I'm always happy to do this and give back to our SLA members and make sure they're getting all of the information that they need.
Well, Leigh, we're honored to have you joining us today. And the first question that I need to ask you is, how did you get to your cool job now? Tell me about your path. When did you decide you wanted to become a sports lawyer? Give us your background.
Sure. So I'm currently the Associate Counsel, Sport, Business, and Entertainment. And I actually ended up in this position through the Sports Lawyers Association. I knew Brandon from a outreach event. He was an outreach captain in Los Angeles. And so it just kind of worked out that he needed an associate and I needed somewhere to go. And he went ahead and hired me on. So my experience is in the Olympic and Paralympic movement and with the WNBA. So I have that organizational sport background. And even with both of those organizations, we always put our athletes first and having that mindset. So I think transitioning to Brandon's law firm where we are putting our athletes at the center of our goals, it really aligns. I actually have a podcast with SLA about how I broke into the sports industry. So anyone who wants to know more in depth about what I did where and how I got involved, please feel free to check out that podcast that's on our SLA webpage.
Thank you, Leigh. And, real quickly, what made you decide that you wanted to become a sports lawyer specifically?
Yeah, so I went to law school and I was actually going to be a public defender. And when I just went through the process, I realized it wasn't for me. I've always been into sport. I was an athlete. I had to give up sport to pursue my academic interests, which kind of sucked, but the love of sport was still there. But I always wanted to be a lawyer ever since I was like in first grade. That was just something that I knew. And really, it's law is the law, and you find that avenue or subject that you want to pursue in law. So whether that be banking, privacy law, sport law, right? You're going to find that special avenue for you and anytime you're in law school. And that's just what it turned out to be for me.
So, Leigh, I'm noticing that you said you're an athlete, and I'm noticing your background here. I see a lot of medals back there. Tell me about those medals back there. I want to know about them. I'm sure all our viewers do too.
So during the pandemic, I decided that I was going to train for a marathon. So that is what these medals are. I participated with the Students Run Los Angeles. So it's a big program that we have here in Los Angeles where we get all of the schools involved, middle school and high school, and we set goals for them throughout the year so that they can train to run the Los Angeles Marathon. It's actually a really big thing. My aunt is a teacher at a junior high. And so she was like, if you want to train for the marathon, we have the schedule, we have the races set up, so let's do it. And over the pandemic, I just virtually trained for a marathon, which was a lot of work. So that's what the medals are. They're like your milestones. So I have like my half marathon, my 5K, my 10K. I think there's 15K. Then you have like your 30K. Yeah, in this platform that we're using, we don't have like the backgrounds. Usually I try to put up a background so you can't see what's behind me. But I have learned through the pandemic, there's ways to like move your desk and computer so that you can have a nice background in the event you can't blur or add a background.
Hey, I love that. And it actually is a good dovetail into our conversation for today, which is virtual networking, because that's a wonderful conversation piece, actually, that doesn't exist when you have a virtual background or you blur it out. And so maybe you just gave everybody a good piece of advice right here for networking in this very odd space. So let's talk about virtual networking. I'm not sure that I really have good advice to give students here or young lawyers, but would love to hear from you. What has worked the best for you with people who network with you in a virtual space? What are some high-level tips that you have for them?
Yeah, so I think virtual networking essentially functions the same as regular networking, right? Because even in person, you go out to a conference, you meet somebody, you get their business card, and you follow up with an email, right? That's generally how we do things in the industry. So I think that it was a fairly easy transition to just reach out to people or email them because that's kind of the habit that we've created. So it's fairly nice that you can rely on that, right? The technology, sending out the emails. Hey, I would love to talk to you. I do think it's a little less personable, right? Because you don't have that face to face. But given that the conference is coming up, right? Everybody's going to have the opportunity to sit in on these panels and find pieces or tidbits that they can maybe relate to and reach out to the panelists directly and say, hey, I saw this panel. I really thought that this piece of what you said was interesting. I didn't really want to ask all the panelists about this one specific question because it really only related to you. So that kind of gives a good segue into how to do that virtual networking. Of course, LinkedIn is always a great space to do virtual networking. I will tell you though, as someone who gets a lot of LinkedIn requests, particularly recently, given my new involvement as the co-chair of the Next Gen Committee, I think that it is invaluable to add a note when you're sending a LinkedIn request. I get a lot of law students and a lot of new lawyers that want to send me LinkedIn requests, and I think that's great. Let's connect. But why are we connecting? What is it that you want to talk about? Or do you just want to connect to me? I don't know that that's going to give you any benefit in the long run because you may connect to me and have a job come up and say, hey, you know this person that's hiring, but I don't know you. I don't know anything about you. So I can't offer any advice to the person that I know for the job that you're applying for. So I think part of that virtual networking is also really having that something to say, even if it's just, hey, hope you're great during the pandemic. How are you managing your mental health? Or what do your weeks look like? How does this work situation challenge you differently and how have you been able to overcome it? Something, right? That's how you start the networking, even if it's face to face, but having it in a virtual setting, whether it be email, LinkedIn, Instagram, right? Twitter. I have lots of people that find me on Instagram, which is really weird. And they're like, hey, I want to ask you things. Like, this has nothing to do with my professional setting. How did you find me?
That's great. Now, Leigh, wonderful advice on LinkedIn. Let's talk about Zoom and all the different iterations of it for a second. I when I was networking early on in my career, I'd go to a cocktail mixer, for instance, and I could kind of tell when it was appropriate to approach somebody, or I could kind of tell when it was all right to immerse myself into a conversation. There's a lot of etiquette surrounding Zoom and video chat that I think is still evolving, and I'm still surprised by what people prefer and what they don't like. Can you talk about some of those high level things about what would make a successful virtual networker in the Zoom environment? Communication tactics, what's the appropriate way to attract somebody's attention, and then just some general no-nos that you've noticed in this pandemic that you could advise to all our young lawyers out there.
Yeah, sure. So I would say that it is definitely hard. I mean, before we started recording, right? One of the jokes that I had with you was when Brandon and I were filming the podcast, we kept talking over each other, right? So I think it definitely depends on who you're speaking to and what your intention is. So if I have a meeting with you, Aaron, it might be a little bit different than if I'm having a meeting with a new lawyer, right? The new lawyer is coming to me to have more of that question information they want to learn, or really absorb what we as the later lawyers, right, have to offer. I'm still a fairly new lawyer. I'm only into like my 5th year of being in the sports industry, so I'm still considered a new lawyer. And anytime I have a call with someone, anyone that is, I wouldn't even say higher than me, but even someone who could possibly be my colleague, right? It's still more of that question. Let me sit and listen to what you have to offer, because the advice that you're giving me is um, a value to me, right? It's not a value to you. You're sharing something with me. And so that's the value that I am receiving. So I think it's really hard because sometimes we will get on calls. I've had calls with new lawyers where they're trying too hard to impress me, right? So I don't feel like they actually want to have a conversation where I can add the value as much as they want to say, "Hey, look at how great I am." We're all great. That's how we all got here, right? We all that's the reality, is like we all went to law school. We all studied for the bar and it sucked, and at some point we passed, right? No matter when you passed the bar, you passed at some point. Or maybe you didn't, you have your JD and that's great. You still went to law school. Law school is a lot of work. Like I went to law school twice. I know, right? I went for my JD and my LLM. Just couldn't get enough of it, evidently. But it's just, these are the things where sometimes you want to have the conversations where you feel that I want to feel valued too, right? I want my time to be valued and respected because I'm a busy person. We're all busy and working. So to take that time and say, hey, yeah, we can have a talk. I think it's really important to sit and listen and absorb. Also be prepared with conversations. You don't want to be on the call and, yeah, I just have a few questions. Great. And they're like, so tell me about, this is the one that I'm not all so happy to hear all the time. Tell me about how you broke into the sports industry, right? I get it. I understand that everybody wants to know. Everyone's path is different. I have not met any lawyer that have had the exact same path of breaking into the sports industry. Um, Matt Massari, who works at Nike, I remember I met with him and his advice to me, and forgive me, Matt, if you've copyrighted this, but his advice is always blaze your own trail, right? It's you blaze your own trail, because no two lawyers are going to have the same walk unless you're literally going to a law firm and you're keeping your head down and you're working billable hours and you're going to work your way up to partner one day. No one has the same walk. So I will say that is in regard to communication and having those meetings, those are the things that stick out to me the most. I know that sometimes, like we said, background, right? Background is a big thing. We have to be understanding during the pandemic, right? People have kids, they have dogs, they might not have the luxury of having an office space, or, so they might have to take calls from their rooms. And so having that grace as a professional, right? I understand that we don't all have the space that we would like to have. But at the same time, I I can tell you I've gotten on Zoom calls and people are eating and finishing their lunch, and then in the middle of changing their background, and it's, I don't need to see all that. Like, keep your camera and your everything on mute, adjust yourself, get on the call. I understand if you have to sit on your bed to take the call, that's fine. Not a big deal. But if you're trying to make an effort to then put a background on to hide it, right? Let's be prepared with that before we get on the call, because now I look at that as how you would prepare for something that we're doing, right? So those are, I don't know if that helped. That's some of the little tidbits, but we try to give grace for some of that. I was on a call with a new lawyer and he was in a room where the lights at his school, like, they turn it on and off. And so every 10 minutes he had to like go like this. It was very entertaining. I was entertained every time he did it, and he was like, and he'd go like this, like very not even realizing, and I'd start laughing. He's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." I'm like, "It's okay. I think you need to see." It's
That's great. And I hear the young lawyer stuff. I when I get on some of these calls and somebody's networking with me or interviewing with me, and they say Mr. Hernandez, I kind of giggle each time a little bit. But I appreciate the hustle there. I've got some notes that I had written down for this. Uh, People seem to universally appreciate a camera that is still in a computer where you're focused on this, and that you've dressed up somewhat, or you at least put if you're a guy, a collared shirt, a nice shirt. If you're a woman, I'm just I've found those themes kind of universally be accepted. I've seen a lot of people get upset with people walking around. We've even had some calls that get cut off, and somebody needs to switch to their phone to use to use network internet. And as long as they just keep it still, and they put it on a stand, they prop it up somewhere, it usually works out pretty well. Those are fascinating points of advice. Now, when there is distraction, when the dog starts barking, or somebody comes in the room and you can't help it, what do you do as somebody who's networking?
So originally, at the outset of the meeting, right, I generally say, because I have dogs, we have 3 dogs in my house, and we have lots of gophers in the backyard that they want to chase all day. So at any given point in time, they will all run into the backyard at once and start barking and circling the backyard. So generally, when I get on a call, I will say, "I'm so sorry if you hear dogs barking in the background," right? For the most part, you can put yourself on mute, especially if you're listening to someone, then your microphone's not on anyway. But there are times when I'm so mid conversation, "I'm so sorry that the dogs are barking." And everybody generally finds it entertaining. I try to, again, be prepared, right? So I will tell whoever I live with, I say, I have a call from this time to this time. So please be mindful of that. Don't knock on my door unless the house is on fire, right? Please try to keep the dogs quiet, right? Some of the simple things. There are things that are inevitable. Like I said, we do have to just be patient right now with what we have, because I don't have any children yet, but I know that other people do. And having kids at home, I couldn't even imagine having to, "I'm sorry, can you hold on a sec? I have to go set my kid up for class. I have to go," or, somebody coming in and saying, "Hey, mommy, it's snack time." Like, I'm hungry, and me saying, "You got to wait 35 minutes." Like, you can't always do that, especially with children, right? It's "Go sit down. Okay, I'll be right with you. I'm sorry, we have to pause." So I think it's having that conversation ahead of time, doing what you can to be prepared, but it's inevitable, right? Like, stuff is going to happen. When we had our first next gen committee, like, information session, my power went out at my house. Like, I was on the call and the power went out, which means the Wi-Fi went out. So I couldn't even get on the call. So I had to drive down to Starbucks and sit in my car to get on this call. And I was like, "I'm so sorry, but my power went out." Like, there was nothing I could do. So it's, you have the conversation, try to be as prepared as you can, have a backup plan, right? Like, I knew the power had been going out all week. So I said ahead of time, if all of a sudden I drop off the call, my power went out, I will drive down the street to Starbucks and I will get back on the call. To your point, though, going back to the appearance, right? um, Again, I think it's, you want to gauge who you're talking to, right? If we weren't on video, I'd probably still be in my workout clothes, Aaron. Like, just just being honest. Like, but if I'm in a client meeting or having a meeting with another lawyer or somebody who potentially could give me a job, right? That maybe I don't know outside of the initial networking session. Yeah, I'm gonna put a little more effort into my appearance than I would if it was just, "Hey, we're on a Zoom, we're catching up," just after years of knowing each other, networking, checking in type of thing.
That's great advice. Leigh Hawley, Associate Counsel of Sports Business and Entertainment at Leopoldus Law in Los Angeles, California. Leigh, I want to focus on two other things here before we let you go, and that's business cards and resumes. And there's a million different ways to go about both of these things, whether it's in person or virtual. But first off, let's discuss business cards. And this is particularly geared towards students, towards law students. Should law students make business cards?
I think so. I always have business cards. I think it's really great because it shows the initiative and professionalism that you have, as well as it gives people the opportunity to contact you should they need anything. It just it helps you stand out as well, right? You're that kid that had business cards, right? And you want to make sure that they're good business cards, right? You don't want them to just be printed off of your printer. I can tell you right now, Staples will do 500 business cards for $10, right? Super simple. They'll even add a QR code. I've always had business cards the whole time I've been in the SLA. Regardless of where I was working, I had my own personal business card, right? Because you don't know where you're going to end up, especially in a year. So much can happen. So always, always, always have business cards. Right now in a virtual setting, it's a little bit harder, right? I know that Teamwork Online does like their virtual business card, and I've seen those and they're cute. I haven't really figured out what to do with them. Like, I guess you could put them in your signature line. But at that point, I kind of feel like everything's in your signature line already, right? In my signature line, I keep my LinkedIn. So it's actually a hyperlink that you can click on and it goes to my LinkedIn page. So that's kind of like a virtual business card, has the information that you need. For resumes, I'm not a fan of having paper resumes at conferences. I think we are all there to network. We're all trying to not have things in our hands aside from our phones because we have to respond to work things. And so if somebody hands you a piece of paper, right, you're like, what do I do with this? It can get lost. It can get sat. I've seen so many resumes from law students get sat down on a table and just like they just forgot. It's not intentional. It's just you're not used to having paper in your hand. So it gets placed and then it's there, and then the law students hurt because then they're like, oh, they left my resume, and it's like it wasn't intentional. They're just really busy and walked away and completely forgot. So I think that you can email your resume, right, just as easily as you can hand someone your resume. Now, do I believe in bringing paper resumes to interviews? Yes, absolutely. Buy the fancy paper that costs $50 at Staples, print out your resume so it's nice and they touch the paper and go, ooh, this is really nice, right? That's always a bonus ad, but I don't know what the value is of actually bringing a paper resume with you to the conference from my experience, right? I'm sure that there's people that have different experiences. Like I said, everybody's legal path is different. But it's just not something that I think. I'm also kind of like an eco-conscious person. So I'm like, don't waste the paper. In general, at the SLA, we don't even hand out like the packets anymore. Everything is digital. So because it's just so many people, we're like, what am I going to do with all this paper? Right. So it's something to just keep in mind. It's about your audience, right? And I think our general audience is not going to want to carry around the paper for 4 days.
I agree. I agree completely with Leigh. I always feel awkward when I get a resume. I don't want to throw it away, but I kind of want to throw it away. I end up getting way more out of somebody who connects with me afterwards, and I get to look at their LinkedIn page, or they email me a resume. So on a virtual conference, this might be the year to take your resume with you. And I wanted to make a point about the business cards. I wholeheartedly agree. In fact, just because we're in a virtual setting doesn't mean you can't look up somebody's address, write out a note, and stick your business card in there. I've made some great connections that way. I hope that many of you all do as well. Leigh, thank you so much for being here. One last question for you. what is some parting advice you have for our young attorneys to have a very successful virtual networking experience at the Sports Lawyers Association this year?
So I think really attending the panels, make sure that you attend the panels and listen to what the panelists have to say, take in all that information. It really helps to take notes during the panels, because even if you don't have the opportunity to ask a question at that moment, sometimes it takes people time to process, right? Like everybody doesn't process at lightning speed. I know I don't. So when you take notes, it gives you the opportunity to then later come back to the panelists and say, hey, I was on this panel. I have this thoughtful question that I put together. So it doesn't seem that you're just asking a question to ask a question, and say like, I'm here asking questions, right? We want that actual network relationship, right? You want that relationship to start building, and you do that by finding that point where you can say, I want to ask you about this, right? And so sometimes that may be a couple days later. The good thing is, once you're a member of the SLA, you have access to our directory, so you can easily find anyone's email and send them a note and say, hey, this panel was great. I just had some follow-up questions on this thing that you talked about. See, my dogs, I don't know if you can hear them, but they're barking.
That's perfect timing, and what a perfect way to end a great session. Again, Leigh Hawley, Associate Counsel for Sports Business and Entertainment at Leopoldus Law in California. Leigh, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Aaron. I look forward to seeing you at the conference.
And thank you. And for the rest of you, we have one more part in this 4-part series with the Sports Lawyers Association. Please join us next time for a conversation with Joe Nara. In the meantime, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.